Hi, welcome back to another Minecraft video. Back in December 2022, XCOM published a video editing VLDA chat for their discovery of a bug which allowed instant transportation. By early January, I was making my own. That journey, which produced one conveyor and wasted many hours of my life on misconceptions, concept ideas, the failed project, and parkouring around contraptions, came to an end by October with heavy burnout on all of Minecraft. Around that time, when I tried working on Minecraft, I'd feel the need to work on it, but I couldn't seem to do anything, and nothing got done. I can't do everything, but I hope you'll bear with me, and if you feel like it, make some conveyors yourself. If you see messages in chat, it's thanks to the TIS Carpet Editions mod, which has been fundamental to the work I have done. The bug that allows instant transportation has been explained as such. Entities, when pushed, record how far they've been pushed for the tick. However, when a piston pushes an entity, it applies the amount the piston has tried to push the entity rather than the distance the entity has covered. This explained some weird behavior some people had noticed prior. What does it mean for a piston to try to push an entity? When an entity is pushed, the game calculates the collision between the entity's surface closest to the moving piston. It gets the distance between the entity and where it needs to go for the block to fit. When the entity is moved, it can collide and stop against blocks or entities with hard collision boxes, including boats and shulkers. So what does an instant conveyor contain? Pistons moving entities forward, and about as much pistons moving them backwards, and a collision that stops them from doing such. To travel a distance, you must be pushed that far, and pistons must try to push you backwards that much. If each moving piston pushes an entity 0.51 blocks, for it to travel 10 blocks, it must be moved by 40 moving pistons in the area covered. It is thus critical, at least for smaller entities, to minimize the area needed to move the entity. A single piston structure may push an entity multiple times, but due to the piston limit, which only allows an entity to be pushed 0.51 in a direction, though if you have pushed them in the opposite direction, a structure can move them 1.02 blocks. This is desirable because having a column you can minimize the amount of air or the pistons. This is desirable because by having a column you minimize the amount of areas needed for the blocks to move into. This makes it easier to translocate entities that are taller vertically or wider horizontally. An additional limitation is that the piston structures move in an order from the direction they are moving to, with the foremost piston pushing the entity first, which means that an entity will be pushed past the structure before any other moving piston could push them, which means that an entity will be pushed past the structure before any other moving piston could push them. This can be mitigated by having the entity within the piston structure, but the entity has to be wide enough to still be within the structure when the next block comes around. This occurs because part of the collision box must be past the furthest surface or the entity will not be moved. For a setup using two blocks one after another in the direction of travel, horizontally and downwards where trapdoors are the shortest surface, the entity must be at least 0.6875 on the axis to be moved a full block, which excludes many mobs. Upwards, however, we can use walls and fences after carpets. There is another possibility. If you use a piston structure that does not feature blocks one after another, but rather next to each other, a shorter, in direction of travel, block can move the entity before a taller one. Due to staying in position, the backwards movements only need the entity to be as wide as the first block. Other than columns pushing you forwards, you can have a column with no air pushing you backwards. However, because of the piston limit, you must retract the pistons connected to the blocks. Or, for the use of extending pistons, you must update each piston after some behind it have already started moving. Also describable as iterating the block event delay every few blocks. With the retraction, you may still have to do similar for the piston's extension when you reset, though the delay may instead be in ticks rather than block event delay. You must also, for both options, trigger them in reverse order to reset. I was the first to utilize in an instant conveyor is that a retracting piston moves an entity up to 0.51 in both directions. First, the piston head retracts. This brings the entity closer to the piston base. This occurs the same as any other block, but with the piston head. Because that retraction could squish an entity between the piston head and the base, Mojang added a push that moves entities away from the piston base. The bottom of the entity must be neither above nor below the block space of the piston block. The amount this motion moves you is the distance it would take for you to reach 0.02 outside the piston base, capped to a motion of 0.51. However, there are problems. Each movement has certain requirements for entity position, and the second movement considers the position the entity has moved to, if it moved then. This can mess up testing. If you think, well, why can't I just use retracting pistons for everything? Pistons need an airspace in front of them to extend, which means you either need to expend that airspace or zero take pistons in, which only works if you add the new pistons in after the prior has finished retracting. That only works for pistons facing in the direction of travel, and the movements from the retractions in direction of travel don't work quite well for thin entities. This trick only works well with floated entities, since piston bases seem to always have a collision. A floated entity is an entity that is only within a block after a few decimal places. A float precise position, or some things like player block placement, do not count them as being there. But more importantly, you can push mobs from blocks that they won't collide with. I have heard that some of the behaviors occur because those entities have a higher float position and collisions only check for blocks with a lower float position, likely for performance. Moving piston moves entities on two sequential ticks. This can be useful since the blocks to move the entity can be half a block over, or for a failed conveyor to have internal collisions when they reach their destination. Due to pistons block events happening in the order they were queued, you can only build a conveyor with pistons activated in the same game tick. For retracting pistons, the second game tick features the piston head closer to the piston base, which allows for shorter mobs to be moved. Yet another restriction for retracting pistons is that they move an entity in a specific position, and while you can have pistons moving an entity such that it's never in a place where retracting piston would be entirely effective. So how do you decide what a mob should be pushed against? There are a few options. You can push in blocks to stop the entity from moving out at appropriate times from the side. It should also be possible to use fence gates or trapdoors. For the use of the second game tick of pistons moving, you can use the moving piston blocks that push the entity as a surface. It is worth noting that as moving piston moves entities in the block entity phase, the blocks immediately after become what the moving piston was moving, internal collisions and all. When pushed by a piston, entities phase through other moving piston blocks in the direction of their movement. You can push against it in the opposite direction. This only works on the first tick of movement because the blocks complete moving if you use the second tick. Scaffolding for upwards conveyors. Entities travel upwards within it but cannot be pushed down at discrete block heights. By pushing in hard collision entities like boats, moved in so the hard entity won't collide with the transported entity while it's moving past. By moving the entity perpendicular to the direction of travel a little bit, I could see this being applied in a diagonal conveyor. I've mentioned that an entity can be effectively moved twice the piston limit from one structure. Doing so has significant benefits in wiring the layout of the conveyor, as it only has to collide with the surface half as often. But there is a potential reason to use the alternative, besides the wiring turn out better in a specific case. Since the former uses the full range of the piston limit, it cannot be used for a theoretical type of instant conveyor, a decay conveyor. In some cases, it may be impossible to give an entity a full 0.51 to their piston limit, but you might be able to get 0.48 or so. In that case, if you use the space at the start of the conveyor, you can start off with 0.51 in your piston limit and decay as you go. I say this is still an instant conveyor if it can move an entity 16 to 18 blocks, because 2 blocks after crossing a chunk border, mobs stop moving for some reason. I don't know why. This effectively means instant conveyors are actually 320 blocks per second conveyors, so long as you wire each segment to move the entity on each subsequent tick. I have yet to see anyone do this. Finally, the last thing of note.